Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Norman, folklore researcher and author. This past weekend, I've been attending the UK Ghost Story Festival in Derby. It's the third year that I've been involved with this, and as always, the weekend was a fascinating mix of author interviews and presentations and workshops and much more. I had the pleasure of interviewing Evelyn Hollow, best known from the Uncanny podcast, but also a great parapsychologist and a scientist and a lady with a very clever mind, and I'm hoping to be able to showcase her and her talents here on the Folklore podcast soon. I also recorded a number of short interviews whilst I was there with other attendees, and I'll be releasing those as bonus content over the next few weeks in the Folklore in the Field strand of the show. Now, as I mentioned last week, this episode is releasing slightly later than usual, and it takes a slightly simpler approach, so my thanks to you for bearing with that. In today's Meet the Author episode, Hilary Wilson is in discussion with Alexandra Beaumont, in a chat which takes in very many aspects of Cornish folklore, a subject to which I hope to be returning on the Folklore podcast soon. Alexandra is a British fantasy novelist, and her latest book, Dissonance of Bird Song, was recently named Distinguished Favourite in the Independent Press Awards. She specialises in both folklore and the gothic in her writing.
Hi, would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Hi, I'm Alexandra Beaumont and I'm a folklore fantasy author. So that means I take those little sort of all like the small stories or the little stories about sort of old wives' tales and that kind of thing. And I think about how I can mash it into a fantasy book setting and then write until my heart's content, really. And yeah, I'm the author of Dissonance of Bird Song, which there it is, which is a Cornish folklore inspired fantasy. I'm sure we'll get into a bit of telling you a little about where Cornwall is and a little bit more about it in a bit. But yeah, it's a very sort of vibrant folklore tale about sort of birds and magical sea.
There
That's
was no
me.
way I was not going to pick up a physical copy of it. The cover is absolutely gorgeous. As a
Um,
big bird
yeah.
enthusiast, I just couldn't entirely resist. But
Yeah, I'm so lucky with the cover.
yes, but you're talking about specifically Cornish folklore to the point that the opening of the book actually has a pretty beautiful map that I lingered on for far too long. Would you like to tell us about what initially drew you to that particular place?
Yeah, sure. So Cornwall, for those who don't know, is the kind of it's a bit of land. It's like a jut out into the sea, basically really far south of the UK. And so it's surrounded on three sides by the sea. And it's this sort of very wild and ethereal place. It's got a lot of mythology and folklore around it. And my mum grew up there for a bit of her childhood. And so she would always tell me these wonderful stories about sort of the mythology of the Mines or birds or King Arthur or any of that good Cornish stuff. And so, yeah, it's always had this kind of special place in my heart from all of those stories that my mum grew up with and then passed on to me. And so I just felt I had to write a book there because I'd never quite got there. And then, yeah, that book is probably now going to turn into a series. So, yeah, I love it that
Fantastic.
much.
I was very much hoping that you would say that. The setting with it is so incredibly strong. There is this almost visceral sense of place where from the very first page you are just surrounded by the sea. You're surrounded by this mist, of course, but also the salt of the sea and the rocks, the kind of harshness of the land. It is a very, as I said before, just this visceral, feeling. Where I live right now, it is pretty darn hot and humid out, and I was actually getting a little bit of a chill, reading it as they're talking about the winter coming. So, how is it that place has, influenced what you're writing? Yeah, I mean, I assume that your mom growing up there, has had an impact on you writing it. But like, how were you doing research about what the land was like?
So, I mean, I've been to Cornwall quite a lot, as you might imagine, sort of going back to the places that my mum
Hmm.
remembered and things like that, and also then going there on my own as well to see it for myself. Yeah, and I just think there's always been something so magical about the landscape for me. It's really rugged down there. The cliffs and the sea is very sort of like the cliffs are very sort of wave beaten and things like that. So I really wanted to capture that, my love of the sea, and pour it into this story, really. Yeah, I mean, as you touched on with the winter, it's a very harsh climate that the people of the Nest, which is a settlement in Dissonance of Bird Song, where they live. And so the book is kind of a lot about how people survive that and the choices they make to survive that. And that sort of comes full circle into some of the sort of folkloric beliefs that I then start to unpack as part of that as well. But yeah, folklore typically has this very sort of powerful sense of place where the landscape becomes as much as a character as the characters themselves. And so that's really what I wanted to achieve here is make the nature and the sea and the sort of cliff tops feel like their own entity.
It was reminding me of the way that the moors within Wuthering Heights are their own character that's reflecting the mood of the people within it. That's a very gothic trope that I was
Yeah.
seeing coming very much into play within Dissonance of Bird Song. With the books starting out, it is getting to be it's getting to be a rather bad time of year. The birds are returning to the nest, are setting here, and the people have a very particular connection, to the birds. Would you like to tell listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hilary. So as you said, the sort of birds have this very sacred symbiotic relationship with the humans of the nest. And so what that means is the winters are very harsh for them. So what they need to do is inhale mist like a magical fog from the lungs of these birds in order to survive. And the birds need to exhale it for them to survive. So they sort of cough it up into the lungs of the humans in this sort of ritualistic fashion. But the mist is running out. So when the mist runs out, the sort of druid of the nests panics really and then sends people to the mines to be sort of mist guzzlers away from the society. So this is really a story of survival and trying to overcome hardship, where Ezeld, the main character, tries to find out why the mist is running out, so her sister doesn't get sent to the mines, basically.
Yeah, and the mines are horrific. It, it was chilling, reading about the conditions there, and those
Mhm.
conditions are all too real throughout history.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think you've sort of tapped into it already with sort of the sense of the Gothic. I mean, that my sort of background specialism is in Gothic literature, so I'm always sort of happy when people pick that out of my books. But yeah, I think that sort of grotesque scenery and that grotesque nature of the mines was definitely sort of another part of that Gothic atmosphere as well, sort of infused in there, I think, right?
I loved it was just I believe, a single throwaway line where you were talking about the knockers in the mine as well. That's a bit of folklore that's carried over here in the US
Oh, okay, yeah.
too. And it's also present in German
Mm.
folklore. And it just was the single offhand mention, but I was then like bracing myself, like, what else are we gonna find in here?
Yeah, I wonder if I might sort of come back and do a bit more about sort of the prevalence of the knockers in a later book, but we'll see.
I loved it. I'm still like part of my mind, I feel, is just going to be trapped in those mines for a while, thinking about some of the experimentations, shall we say, that are going on in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, the mist was such a fascinating concept to me. It was almost like a drug to the people, but it also, as you were saying, they've developed this symbiotic relationship over time. And from a world building perspective, it just got me thinking about how this might have started. Because the image of the bird, coughing up the mist is, so similar to how they feed their young.
Yep.
And it's almost like the bird is the caretaker for these people. It just has a lot of really interesting possibilities.
Yeah, and I think it'd be quite interesting to explore who sort of tried it for the first
Yeah.
time. I always wonder this about when people eat things for the first time, like who thought of that?
Yes.
Why did you eat an oyster? Like what? Um, yeah, I think that would be quite an interesting thing to sort of unpack maybe in a prequel origin story one day. But I mean, they used to sort of find out in chapter one that the mists came with the birds for the first time because something happened, but nobody really knew why. So there's this inherent mystery as part of the birds anyway, because nobody quite knew where they came from, and that's part of the book as well. But yeah, that kind of mysticism of the moors is kind of something that I've experienced like quite a lot in yeah, recently. Particularly. And yeah, I'll pause there. But I've got a very weird story about a hotel we stayed in
Oh, we
recently.
love weird stories and we love hotel stories. That's one of the most liminal spaces you can find in modern day, isn't it?
Isn't it just like they're very, very odd spaces, aren't they? But yeah, so me and my husband went to a place called Llanelli Hall Suites in Wales. I've probably butchered that pronunciation, but it's like this old manor house that this
Mhm.
group of people had bought. And it's kind of on this like more like drive up out of no into nowhere basically. And they'd told us in the booking when we'd booked it, oh, this is a renovation project, so be prepared for that. But what I wasn't quite prepared for was when we got there, they sort of said, "Come and find us in the orangery, and we'll show you to your room." So we did that, um, and they take you up to the room, which was very charming, and it was a lovely place, and the rooms were beautiful. But you kind of went through like the renovation corridor while you got there,
Mhm.
and then I said to them, "Oh, how do we lock the door?" And they said, "We don't have locks on the doors here." And I was thinking, "Oh God." And it's a beautiful place, I will say, but the sort of inner like folk horror
Yeah.
mindset was wearing for me. Made only worse by the fact when we came down to go out to somewhere for dinner, I was a bit curious about like how they were running this whole renovation. And so I was like, how
Mhm.
did you come by it? Was this house in the family? Did you buy it or something like that? And they said, oh yes, four of us bought this property together. Only two of us are left. And then didn't say anything more about why, which was a whole thing. And then we went for an explore, as you would do, obviously,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
and ended up in a bit of the grounds where they then came and found us and were like, "This isn't for the guests. Please turn around." And I was thinking, okay, this is where they murder people in the like, yeah, behind the thing, which wasn't the case. We left very, very happily. But they were like, "But we have excavated a Japanese garden. We dug it up. You could go and have a look at that instead if you like." I'm like, okay, right. So the doors don't lock. We're in the middle of nowhere. Four people bought this and only two are left. And you dug up a clearly cursed garden. Like,
Yeah.
I just couldn't find any more horror tropes. And like you couldn't make it up. So yeah, I'm sure I'm gonna write that at some point. But I say this because it's a really good example of folklore as place. Like,
Oh,
can't make
yes.
it up.
Oh, it sounds almost like a League of Gentlemen sketch. Like
Doesn't it just
everything just perfectly falling into place as it
Mhm.
goes on.
Yeah.
Did you end up visiting the garden?
We did. It was beautiful. It was really nice, and the stay was lovely. And I would absolutely recommend you go there. And I'm not just saying this so they don't listen to this and then like sue me or something. Like genuinely, I would go back there. It was a beautiful house, and I think when they finished renovating it, it will be really, really
Are you
like
sure
even
this
more
isn't
lovely
like
than it
a
is.
ring situation where you have to get somebody else to visit there in a certain
Well,
amount of
yeah, maybe
time?
maybe this is my way of getting other people to go there.
Yeah. I mean,
Seems
it
like
sounds like an
podcasting.
entertaining stay.
It was really good. Yeah, it was lovely. And they'd done up the rooms in a gothic style, which suited me down to a
Oh,
T.
that's great.
It was nice.
I love that. I want to see pictures of this place now.
I'll have to send you the link later.
Oh, please. But back to the birds. One
Mm.
of the things that I've been dying to ask you since reading it is these birds are very particular. They're a very unique species, and one of the things that you focus on in the descriptions of them is the coloration.
Yeah.
And the coloration was something I found fascinating. Was there any particular reason that you chose the colors that you did for the plumage?
Yeah, because they have sort of a really like vibrant blue plumage.
Yeah, the
And
azure.
sorry?
Azure was the word that
Yes.
you were using to describe it, which is beautiful with the black and white wings
Mm.
and red beaks, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, yeah. So there's a mix of things going on here. The blue is kind of a link to the sea because that's where they're coming from. Um, and the sort of the black and white. So the black feathers and the red beaks come from the sort of one of the native Cornish birds, the Cornish chough, or which is a crow, but a very sort of crow that's specific to Cornwall. And they have quite a lot of folklore surrounding them. Um, in sort of various stories, King Arthur, when he dies, doesn't die, but he reincarnates as a Cornish chough. And so I just thought, yeah, if I'm gonna have like a bird that has this sort of mystical property that has some kind of link to human souls and that sort of thing, it has to have some of the traits of Cornish crow. So yeah, that was kind of my logic behind it, really.
Oh, it's a beautiful image, and the red of the beak was also making me think about in Welsh folklore, um, because canids are often my specialty. I was thinking about some of the dogs of the underworld that
Mm.
are white with then red ears, and
Yeah,
so that red is just such a vibrant color.
yeah. I mean, it's quite a sort of Celtic color as well. It comes out in a lot of the decorations, like yeah, those hounds particularly that you're mentioning from like Welsh folklore, I think are
Mhm.
just such a sort of striking image, aren't they, when you see them done with like the white swirls and the red ears like coming over
Yeah.
the top. If you haven't read it, check out Lucy Holland's books, Sister Song and Song of the Huntress, because in the that's very much in that sort of wheelhouse of
I'm gonna
folkloric
write it down.
writing.
Yeah, it was just a beautiful image, and I love that you're drawing from, the Arthurian mythos. A lot of people associate the Arthurian mythos only with, England in particular, but so much of it is, going back to Wales and going back to Cornwall, and there's just so many interesting little avenues that you can go down with that.
Yeah,
It's
definitely.
it's definitely something that was coming through within your book as well, because it is a very gothic romance, and it is a very beautiful romance. And which part is which is something that you'll just have to read to find out.
Absolutely. And yeah, also decide for yourselves how much gothic and how much romance, because some people have interpreted it very differently about how romantic it truly is. But yeah.
I mean, there's definitely some big gothic influence when it comes to um some of the original romance, shall we say,
Absolutely.
that's present. There's a lot of tragedy. And that tragedy is played upon in some really interesting ways. Again, my mind was going back to Wuthering Heights, if only because that's in the news cycle so much right now. But in spite of how much it was going back to Wuthering Heights, some aspects of it were still very much surprising me.
Okay.
There, which I was delighted by. Um, and akin to once more Wuthering Heights, so much of what was happening within the book, not just in regards to romantic relationships, but relationships and interpersonal relationships in general, was
Mm.
coming down to a matter of consent and a matter of choice. And I thought that the way that you were interrogating that was extremely interesting.
Oh, interesting. With which particular characters or just all of them?
I mean, it was to a degree all of them, but right from the beginning, you have how the druid is being interacted with,
Mm.
with him controlling all of the people, and your main character wants to figure out what's going on. Every year the birds are returning and there's less birds than there were previously. And the loss of these birds, is not just a matter of, oh, our livelihood is in danger. It is literally our lives are in danger
Yeah.
because of the symbiotic relationship. But
Mm.
the druid, due to his fear of, what's going to happen if people leave, what's going to happen. We don't know how this connection is going to be affected, by this. So no, you can't go, even though it's literally killing everybody in the nest. This
Yeah.
very slow, sad, torturous death, for
Mm.
various reasons that I'm not going to touch upon too deeply because I want people to read this book. But he's making this choice for her,
Yeah.
against her will, even though it's Isolde, right?
Ezeld or Isolde, yeah, either of
Isolde.
those.
Yeah, she even though she wants to, go, she's making this choice. She's putting her life at risk, by making this choice. He just still won't let her. And as the story goes on, more and more people are trying to make these choices for her,
Mm.
whether she wants it or not, whether through being in a position of authority or through, the more mystical means, which comes into play in some really fascinating and disturbing ways,
Yeah.
as she goes out to sea.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
and sort of choice is quite a sort of, as you picked up on, it's quite a strong theme in this.
Mhm.
I mean, one of the things that sort of I almost wanted her to be powerless to start with because I wanted her to sort of fight for her own freedom. And so, I mean, the sort of dedication in the front of the book, I don't know if you sort of saw this bit, I'm just getting it to check that I've done the wording properly, is to anyone fighting to find their own path, this is for you.
Yes.
Because I wrote this sort of very much thinking about the times where I had struggled to find my path and had to really fight for freedom and the things that I needed and the things that I wanted and that sort of thing. So yeah, Ezel's story really is doing that, is sort of showing where she's fought to overcome all of these sort of adversities we've just talked about, really. Um, yeah, and the druid, I love the character of the druid, if I do say so myself,
Same.
because he's not meant to be. He's a villain, but he isn't as well. He's sort of a tragic villain, if that makes sense.
His
Um,
choices were making sense to me.
Yeah, and I think I almost feel sorry for him actually.
Yeah.
And readers will see why when you get to sort of further through the book as to why the druid is sort of a pitiable character almost in some ways, isn't he?
Yeah, he's stuck in a pretty impossible situation, and it's easy to, see him as just purely villainous. But
Mhm.
as the world starts expanding, because to begin with, the world is the nest. It's this very, very small area that you only know about the larger world through, some allusions to some very minor raids that had happened at some point,
Yeah,
and it's a very insular society, but then the world naturally starts growing. And when it grows in a massive way. It's so cool to see because, the scales are being lifted from your eyes, as they are for Esseld.
scales
And
now.
it, as that perspective gets larger, you start to realize, oh, well, the druid's kind of right. Like the choices are very hard and they're not great, but he's also in this really impossible position. And I'm excited about you saying that there's possibly going to be more books because I would love to see, how things progress, given how this one ends up ending.
Mm, I have, yeah. I mean, I'm about to start. I'm in the process of starting the sequel, which I'm really excited about, actually. I'm still, yeah. I have a completely crazy, ambitious idea for what I'm doing with the world from here on out. And we can't really say anything without sort of spoiling what happens at the end of the book. But
Which is a
um,
fantastic ending. I just want to say it goes in some really interesting directions. Some of my favorite bits of folklore are the trickster stories, and so much within
Mm,
this book, because you're dealing with druids, so you're dealing with oaths, you're dealing with pacts.
yeah.
So much is coming down to some of that trickstery, be careful what you say and what you agree to, um,
Yeah.
situations.
There's
So
always
things will hit you out of left field.
Yeah, and you've realized that one of your promise overlaps like awkwardly with
Yes.
another one or something like that. It's a really lovely like Celtic kind of trope where you've got two oaths binding you to do two completely different things, and it is your
Yeah.
undoing. That's definitely, I think, something that Ezeld struggles with.
And it's a fascinating struggle to watch. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about another piece of folklore that plays very heavily within this, which is, it would be wrong to say mermaids. Um,
Merfolk.
yeah,
Merfolk is
merfolk,
appropriate.
uh,
Yeah.
sea peoples. I mean,
Mhm.
you draw on some really interesting folklore there. Some of it was actually reminding me of Selkie stories.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
the way that you were tying it in, the tragedy, the complications that occur. But would you like to talk a little bit about that without giving away too much?
Yeah, it's quite an
Complicated, I
interesting
know.
one because usually I sort of don't talk much about the merfolk bit of it because it's sort of I think comes as quite as a surprise where some of the story goes. But just to sort of summarize, I guess, a bit of the folklore behind it and why I made this choice is Ezeld. So the people of we've talked about sort of how the birds exhale mist into the lungs, and the people in the nest use that to survive. So uh Ezeld's sister Nessa coughs that mist back into fire to keep them warm and heal them in winter. Ezeld has made a different choice and she uses it to channel into song to charm people, to influence situations in the way that she needs to. And that has this real sort of neat tie-in with merfolk folklore in Cornish um, stories. Particularly, there's a story, The Mermaid of Zennor, which is about this mermaid coming onto shore and hearing the song of this man in a church and liking how he sounds when he's singing so much that she sort of lures him away to come and be her husband and things like that. And it's not a tragic story by any stretch. Like essentially they seem to go off and live happily ever after in the sea somewhere. But they only really find out what happened when like they see the mermaid again some years later. And so there's kind of this sort of sacredness of the beauty of song and that I think comes through quite strongly in that. And that's one of the things that sort of very much comes through in this story is the power of song.
Yeah, there's a beautiful lyricism to a lot of the book, and you actually include snippets of song in
Mm.
there, and it was really fun reading it and feeling some of the rhythm of it trying to imagine how it would sound. And I love the siren aspect of it. Song is such an important aspect of life.
Yeah, absolutely. And you sort of see songs in books sometimes, right? But it's not, you don't see it as much recently. But it's one of the things that I loved about sort of Tolkien's books was that you had all of the songs written in there. And okay, the ones that I'm using are sort of traditional folk songs rather than, well, mostly there's one that I sort of made up. But yeah, it's just, I don't know, it just brings alive the culture for me and helps me
Yeah.
write it.
Well, I
So,
mean,
yeah.
like I said, when the world starts opening it up, it opens up in a very large way. You
Mm,
start to think about how would the song have been originally written? What would have gone into this? It just adds
yeah.
to the allure. And you hint also at the larger world with some of the drawings and carvings that exist elsewhere, which I thought was just another fascinating look at the deep past. I had the pleasure of talking recently with David Keohan, who
Mm.
is going throughout Ireland and finding the strength stones picking up the strength stones.
Oh, cool.
And he was talking about how with these stones. You're standing there, you're touching something, you're interacting with something that people have been interacting with for thousands upon thousands of years.
Mm.
And you're reading about the carvings in the caverns, these things chiseled into the wall, these remnants of past culture. It gives that similar idea of this deep history, which is just
Yeah.
awesome.
And there's something so when you see those old carvings and sort of like Ogham on sort of stones in Scotland and things like that, there's just something so like they did this thousands of years ago, and some of the art is actually quite intricate, and
Oh,
I love
yeah.
that. So yeah, it sort of makes me very happy.
It's so cool to imagine. And talking about it within the caverns, you have the added idea of it being lit by just this little bit of firelight,
Mm,
which would give it an animated look. You get to see
yes.
some of that with the Cave of Forgotten Dreams that Werner Herzog did with the Lascaux caverns.
Yeah.
And so it has this visceral reaction, this idea of deep history. And you have so much of that, throughout Britain. Um,
Yeah, definitely.
have to look a little bit harder here in America, but there are plenty of places that you can still go.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard some really interesting stories actually about sort of bits of America that have their own like folklore cropping up. So yeah, I mean, it goes anywhere where there are humans, so why not,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, sometimes just have to look a little bit harder, get out of the cities and the world starts opening up once more.
Yeah,
But so
absolutely.
one of the things that is great about this book and is extremely fun, is the way that you were naming the characters. You actually have a little bit of a appendix at the back where you go into some of it. Could you talk a little bit about how you were doing that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, this is the appendix that, well, you might not be able to see it. There you go. Oh,
Yeah,
there you are.
it's great.
So there are some names basically in the back, and I sort of some of these I sort of put together from Cornish words that I wanted to sort of take a hybrid of meanings and mesh them together. So a good example of this is there's a character whose name literally translates into fishkin within the book. And so how I created the sort of Cornish name for that, if you like, was taking the Cornish word for fish and the Cornish word for skin and shoving it together and thinking, huh, surprisingly, that works really well as like a
It
vernacular.
does.
Um, yeah, others are kind of traditional Cornish names. So Izeld or Ezeld is a very traditional sort of Cornish name. It's also sort of famous from the Tristan and Isolde
Hmm.
myth. And it's thought to mean ice battle, which is also kind of fitting. But yeah,
Yeah.
I love meaning. I love sort of the meaning behind words, and as we've sort of already touched on, some of that sort of meaning of what you say in language is really important to this book. So it felt very fitting to have some of that sort of glossary spelling out all the meanings. And also, we don't often get to put our research into books. So I was like, damn it, I'm going to
Yes.
put some research in the back of my book.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun, especially when you're getting into a genre like fantasy,
Mm,
where people used to get more of this than they are right now. I
yeah.
mean, I'm one of those people who was going crazy over the footnotes in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell.
Yeah. So many footnotes. My other half is reading that at the moment, and sometimes he just shows me and he's like, look, 75% of this page is footnotes. I'm like, eh?
And they rock is the thing.
Yeah, I love it. It's such a cool idea, and I love that a fantasy book that is that unusual got published because you don't always hear that story, do you?
Yeah, and I think that there's a certain hunger for it. I
Yeah.
mean, when you're able to dig into something that has a grounding within actual folklore, there
Hmm.
is a depth to the book that you don't necessarily find elsewhere. You get to recognize these things from, your local tradition or traditions that you've read about, and you can place it within place, you can place it within your mind. It just makes the world larger. It
Yeah.
makes it more fun.
Absolutely. And then you can feel that there's a richness behind what you're reading and the story you're being told as well, which I think all too often in some sort of books now I've seen like they're quite sort of, I don't want to sort of down talk them, but you can just see quite like plaintive tales almost. And I like to feel like there's something greater behind it. So yeah, I think it works quite well for that, doesn't it?
There's also a degree of cynicism within a lot of not just books, but popular culture right now in general. And while there's plenty of reason to be feeling that way, considering everything,
Mm,
one of the things that really appealed to me within this book that goes back to what you were talking about, place, with the harshness of the cliffs, the sea
mm,
battled cliffs of Cornwall, the harshness of the winter, what everybody's going through. In spite of these hardships, there is still this earnest optimism
yeah.
that comes through, particularly with one character that I'm thinking of, who you'll get to meet a little bit deeper into the tale. But with Isolde as well, Eseld as well, you get this optimism that things might be hard right now, but I'm going to get through it anyway because what other choice do I have? And to see that with a character who is going through as much as she's going through,
Mm,
having the chronic condition that she has
yeah.
and everything, it was very inspirational. Um, particularly for me, I have some chronic pain issues myself. So to see a character optimistic about the future in spite of these really, really difficult odds, it rocked.
Thank you. I mean, I'm really glad that came across because that was one of the main things I wanted to do with dissonance, really, was sort of look at that sort of chronic condition thing. Because at the time, I mean, it's ongoing, as we know. You never quite get rid of it, do you? Obviously, that's the nature of it. But at the time of writing, I was being diagnosed with like a chronic sinusitis condition, which is essentially like means that my nose can bleed at any given moment at the drop of a hat, and we don't know why. And then it makes things hard because then you can't go to certain places if
Yeah.
you think that it's going to trigger it and things like that. So yeah, and I thought I was sort of finding that really hard. And like you said, like what I wanted to do was not have a story which was like thinking about like my story. I didn't want my story to be that of the victim where this was it. This was everything that I was ever going to be. So Ezeld's story or Iseld's story is really that story as well, of like overcoming because she has what you would probably term as chronic sinusitis now.
Yeah.
But obviously, in Bronze Age England, Britain, you didn't have that word. So yeah, she's sort of very much like going through that journey of trying to overcome it and sort of everything that goes with that, but trying to maintain some optimism. And that just gave me a bit of hope as well that it was possible.
Yeah, it's nice also reading a character, with a condition like that who is not being accused of witchcraft or,
Mm,
being seen as a, very negative, terrible other. She is an active part of society. She's able to, do things. This is just something that she's dealing with. And I think that that aspect of disability is something that we forget did actually exist as well.
yeah,
There were people who were not being, accused of terrible things for being different. They were just integrated into society, and
yeah.
people were not only okay with that, but were making accommodations for them and the like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's sort of what I wanted to give back to readers really was a bit of hope that and a bit of sort of sense of belonging as well, I think, is what I found a lot from writing it that I wanted to give to readers as well who might be going through similar situations. But yeah, I mean, I think sort of back to some of the tales of people like sort of Ivor the Boneless who
Yes.
conquered armies on the back of a shield type thing. And
Yeah.
it's like, it's yeah, why not, right? Why not?
Yeah, and I mean, even within prehistory, we have, footprints that show families where a person's using a cane and,
Mm,
has a limp. And it's like this was not, this was something that's always existed, that will always exist.
yeah,
And, one of the things that I also appreciated, not to get too off topic, was also the fact that there is not really a fix for it within the story either.
Yeah.
You can have moments of relief, you can have,
Mhm.
times where you're feeling really, really good, but it's
Yeah.
still there. It's still part of you. And while it sucks at times, it also is okay because it is you.
Yes, absolutely. And that was a really, I mean, you'll be unsurprised to hear that's a really conscious choice because I didn't want to
Yeah.
just be like, hey, look, you can cure it. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Um,
was relating to it heavily.
yeah, and I mean, I'm really pleased to hear that. It sort of makes me feel like I've sort of achieved what I tried to do at creating a sort of a relatable story in that respect. But I think all too many times, like you get that whole thing sometimes in books, don't you, of like the magical cure to the bad
Yep.
thing. And I was like, I'm not going to do that. Like it's going to be ever prevalent depending on what she does. And
Yeah.
sometimes just because
Yeah.
that's how it
And
is, really, isn't it?
that 100% is how it is. I have a back issue and things will be going great and then I'll just take one step the same as the previous step and then it's like, "Oh, right, this hurts."
Yeah.
Just
I'm
comes out of
sorry.
nowhere.
Yeah. I'm sorry you're also experiencing that sort of thing.
I
It
think
sucks.
most people have something.
Yeah, that's true.
It might always be obvious, but everybody has something and it's
Yeah.
nice to actually be able to relate to somebody when you're reading some fiction.
Yeah.
The other thing that I really appreciated was the diversity of relationships,
Mm.
where the sexuality is a little bit more fluid, and it's not something that's really commented on or attention is drawn to it. But that's another thing that often has existed throughout history that gets brushed over a
Yeah.
little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this was a sort of conscious choice I made, obviously. And I'll segue in a sec, probably just to briefly talk about my other book, which I also do similar
Please.
on. But yeah, for Dissonance of Birdsong, I wanted it to be very accepted and just sort of part of the norm. Like Iselde, she's bisexual. That doesn't get explicitly stated, but like it's kind of clear if you look at how she talks about different people. Um,
Very sweet, actually.
yeah, yeah, she kind of, I don't know, she's a bit of a romantic, I think.
Oh, definitely, but
Um,
relatable.
but yeah, it's just kind of there, isn't it? Yeah, and I sort of did it more subtly with this book. I just sort of referenced my other book, Testament of the Stars, where it's it's more of a sapphic romance, I'd say, between
Hmm.
the two main characters, Anya and Tolska. Um, but in that, sort of, I'm a bit more like you can tell when your writing matures a bit because in that one, I was very much like, these are my principles and here they are. Um, and so it's very much like there's sort of a bit of an explanation about like how marriage works in the Testament of the Stars world, which is like you have marriage for lots of different purposes, like for politics, for romance, for childbirth and things like that. But it's a very inclusive sort of marriage to say like you're just doing it based on like what you want to get out of it, not because of like who it is or anything like that,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Um, so yeah, yeah. So I wish we saw more fantasy where it was just kind of normative within the society, whereas all too often, like I've read stuff that I've liked, but I felt like a key sort of bit of the story has been like I think I might actually be a lesbian, and
Yeah.
here's my pontification about how that might be the case. Oh, it's really hard because I didn't really think that I was going to be, and things like that. And like, there is a place for a story like that, absolutely. But I think there's also a place for we just are, and we're getting on with it.
It reminds me a little bit of how Star Trek will do it, where they'll just like go to another planet and then it's like, this is how the society works here, and nobody
Mhm.
thinks this is strange. Nobody is really struggling. It just is. And you're getting to see a brief moment of that in time.
Yeah.
And I love that because you're just, within this where it's an inclusive society, when it comes to this aspect of it. And when you're getting that within a fantasy world, regardless of how it was within, actual historicity, and there's plenty of debates about that,
Hmm.
you can start to imagine like how things might have gone differently.
Yeah,
And coming out narratives are great, but there's also a lot of them, and it's nice to just see something where there isn't any, internal questioning about it. It just is.
absolutely. And yeah, don't get me wrong, like I do like a coming out story. Like they have their place and there's some really good fantasy that does that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I definitely agree. It's just nice to have it established sometimes and not feel like it's this sort of othering story you need to tell.
Yeah, the Marvelous Light series, which is in the Edwardian times, does a
Mm,
really interesting coming out story.
okay.
Within that, with I think that the first one is a gay romance, the second one's a lesbian romance. It's a
Mm,
lot of fun. I liked seeing how they were able to incorporate it within the historical narrative. But
yeah.
yeah, I think it's great to just see something where, that sort of diversity and inclusivity is just baked in already, within the society. And it was, pretty subtly done and just a delight to read.
I'm glad that
You
came across.
especially don't get to see a lot of bisexual representation. So it was
Yeah.
very nice to see that.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't always talk about this because I find sort of these things quite like inherently private. But what I will say is like I didn't feel like there was enough bisexual rep in the fantasy I read growing up.
Oh,
Mm.
100%.
Take from yeah,
There really was not, especially for, the time period when I was growing up as well.
yeah,
It isn't there, and it still isn't there to a good degree. So it's nice to actually get to see it in there.
yeah, absolutely. And I think if when I was growing up, or and like same for you, right? Like when we
Yeah.
were growing up, maybe things would have felt a bit more accepting
Oh,
if
100%.
we had this narrative like just casually there and available, right?
Oh, 100%, especially here in America, because when I was, the period that I was growing up and maturing was also when gay marriage was getting constantly,
Mm,
challenged and debated. And, you know, being able to see things like that, which, again, Star Trek was doing, right
yeah,
back then, it would have been just a lot nicer to see it existing within fantasy narratives as well, because that was what I was devouring at the time.
yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I'm happy to see that, the wheels are slowly changing.
Mhm.
The tide is turning, to have a
Yeah,
more apt metaphor for your book here. But
absolutely.
yeah, I really liked this book. I'm really excited that there's going to be more because I definitely fell in love with this world and with the lyricism of your writing. There's so much folklore in here and so much that I want to touch on, but I also don't want to because I want people to read it and I don't want to spoil anything because there's some really fun twists and turns and unexpected places that the
Mhm.
book goes. So it's Dissonance of Bird Song with this absolutely beautiful cover. You can get it anywhere books are sold. But where can people go to find you online? Where can they find updates about what you're working on? Um, get in touch if you are open to people getting in touch with you.
Yeah, please do. I love to talk about folklore and just hear from people who've read Dissonance and any of my books as well. So yeah, you can find me on X at A Beaumont Writer. I we can probably put the links in the chat and the material as well, can't we? I'm
Oh,
also
definitely.
on Instagram and Facebook as well. On all of those platforms, you can find my link tree, which will take you to a little bit more information and my website, which yeah has more sort of links to other interviews and things I've done and all that jazz.
Yeah. And I want to say if you follow on Twitter, which is where I'm following you right now, and I'm going to follow you on the other places, you post some absolutely wonderful little tidbits of folklore extremely often. And it is just fantastic. Instead of just doom scrolling, you'll learn about what hedgehogs were like throughout
Absolutely.
folklore. And it's just a really nice way to break up some of the terror that can be going on at any given moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And on my Instagram as well, at the moment I'm doing a costume challenge, which is like posting a picture of a costume every day, which we didn't quite get around to talking about LARP, but because I'm a live action role player, I have a lot of costumes. So yeah, if you
Awesome.
fancy like fantasy costume stuff as well as books, that's where to look.
Well, thank you very much for your time, and I hope I get
Thank
to
you.
chat with you again soon.
I would love that. It's been wonderful. Thank you, Hilary.
My thanks to Alexandra for joining us for this episode, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to welcome her back very soon as part of a wider panel discussion on the folklore of Cornwall, so watch this space for more on that. I'll be back very soon with the next episode of the main podcast strand, where we'll be welcoming back Einar Selvik, the lead singer with Wardruna. Now, in the meantime, you can access more material from the podcast on our Patreon page at patreon.com/the folklore podcast, where you can also subscribe as either a free or a paying member. Free members get access to our storytelling episodes, and paid members also get a range of other benefits and content. Support for that starts at just £1 a month, and it really is vital for helping to keep the podcast going. So I hope to see you there. Thanks for watching. See you next time.